All right, guys, this is Daniel here with Driving and Dragons with another D&D Reacts. I'm going to have to make an admission here. This is not going to be a fresh reaction. Normally, when I try to do reactions, especially to stuff like this, I try to hop in and grab a video I haven't seen and give you the naked, unabashed reaction with no prior knowledge. In this case, I had a couple of these recordings get interrupted. I had a few that had some serious audio issues, so I'm having to re-record this. But we have old generic GinnyDi here, and she has these 10 types of D&D lead to totally different games. It's based off of a somewhat faulty list in the back of the Dungeon Master's Guide for 5th edition about different types of fantasy and play style that D&D can be used for. But we're going to go ahead and give her the honest listen and the fair shake. Just a heads up, this one's going to be a bit of a long one. It is a 26-minute original video, and even when I go back and cut out her ad from the middle, it's still going to be a chunk. So buckle up for a nice long one here. And we're going to play a little drinking game too. I want everybody to just take a drink every time she does some kind of sexualization or sexual reference, mainly because there's this odd group out there that tries to say that GinnyDi is not basically selling sex, like that she's not, that her brand is not basically trying to be dirty without being dirty. You know, the whole I'd be an OnlyFans if I didn't have too much pride type deal. So we're going to see just how many times she makes a totally unnecessary sexual reference just to, I guess, halfway be funny. But we're going to take a look at that. So let's buckle up here and talk about these 10 types of D&D.
Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy game, but fantasy isn't really just one genre, it's 10 genres in a trench coat. And whether you're a game master or a player, if you have a different type of fantasy in mind than the other people at the table, you might end up disappointed. Somebody who wants to be playing Lord of the Rings may not enjoy playing Clash of the Titans, and somebody who wants to be playing Game of Thrones Season 1 probably won't enjoy playing Game of Thrones Season 8, unless they like being confused and unsatisfied. Whatever, I'm not here to kink shame. Everybody
Well, that was quick. Drank.
wants to find the right game table, but that's really tough to do if you don't know how to express what you want. Thankfully, there's a list in the Dungeon Master's Guide that outlines 10 fantasy subgenres and how they might show up in a game. The only problem is, this is a useful tool for players too, and only DMs read the DMG. Actually, read might be a generous word.
It is definitely a generous word for GinnyDi and her ilk. Remember, this is the dungeon tuber person you go to for advice, big, millions of views YouTube channel that specializes in D&D, and she only just read the Dungeon Master's Guide like earlier this year.
I've seen the statistics. Most DMs are just confidently winging it and hoping nobody notices. Today we'll talk through what each of these genres means, so none of you has to crack open this accursed tome if you don't want to, and we'll also discuss which types of players are most likely to enjoy which types of games. Plus, I'll give you some quick tips for DMing within each of these genres. Oh!
I do love how she calls it the accursed tome here. The simple fact of the matter is that, well, 90% of her content wouldn't necessarily need to exist if people read the DMG, because usually when she comes up with some, when I learned this little trick, it made my game so much easier. It's literally in the Dungeon Master's Guide. She just didn't read it. And unfortunately, a large portion of the hobby doesn't. And before my fellow grognard OSR guys want to jump down in the comment section and talk about tourists and stuff, you're just as guilty. You're just as guilty. I don't care what edition we're talking about, first, second, third, 3.5, fourth, whatever. All of you guys were shortchanging reading your rule books early on. Let's not play games like there's a lot of forever GMs who have never cracked the DMG more than once or twice, except to look at like the magic items table.
And I have 2 genres that I think don't belong in D&D at all, which means this 10-point list is now 12 points, so we'd better get started before it gets any longer. I don't know how many more of these genres will fit in this trench coat. Heroic fantasy is the classic. It's what most people.
Let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to do a short description of each one of these at the beginning. So heroic fantasy, she's already started to say it's the default. It is the default for D&D. Let's just be honest about that. But heroic fantasy as a subgenre essentially means that it's not necessarily super heroic fantasy, but the hallmark is going to be that the characters themselves are a large cut above the norm. And in most cases, what that means when you're playing heroic fantasy is that you're going to need more epic scale adventures and epic scale challenges, because the entire concept is these players are already beyond what we would normally call a hero type character. They're already established. They already have power. Level 1 is already somebody who is many cuts above like the regular town guard or whatever.
Picture when they think of D&D. The world is fantastical, vaguely medieval, and full of magic and monsters. The characters have left behind their humble beginnings to plunder dungeons, slay baddies, and leave a trail of broken doors and questionable moral choices behind them. Don't let the word heroic fool you. The characters in these games aren't necessarily do-gooders. Sure, they're fighting foul monsters and wicked villains, but they're just as likely to be doing it for vengeance or glory, or because they heard the dragon was sitting on a really big pile of gold, and they recently bought a new enchanted sword on credit. Some examples of this include The Witcher show on Netflix, and unsurprisingly, a lot of media that's inspired by Dungeons and Dragons, like The Legend of Vox Machina and the recent D&D movie Honor Among Thieves. Basically, any movie where a hero says a quippy one-liner before stabbing somebody. I mean, that's why I always carry a sword. It's a strong punchline. For a lot of people,
that's really not. That joke got tired pretty quick. She's absolutely right in one respect here. You don't want to get hung up on the word heroic in the way of we think of like everyday heroes, not the game, but like firefighter, police officer, rescue diver, that sort of thing. Heroic is a description of a power level here. The big thing is in heroic fantasy, the scale is epic. You're not, like I said, even level 1, you're not dealing with the humble beginnings, and you're not dealing with the overcoming the overwhelming odds everyman. If you think of more heroic fantasy books and genre films and stuff, generally the everyman is the odd man out in the party. It's, oh, this is the person who kind of has to be here because he's the son of the son of the son of the son of the original guy, and he's the only one who can carry the MacGuffin or whatever. But he's surrounded by the elite super spy and the mega warrior and the powerful sorcerer, all super elites. And this is the default for Dungeons and Dragons. This is what Drizzt Do'Urden and all of his series is, Dark Elf Trilogy, Icewind Dale Trilogy, all that stuff. This is where Elminster is. This is anything having to do with Red Wizards of Thay and all that kind of nonsense. This is 100%. And even going into Greyhawk, this is in 100% what D&D is built on.
This is the only fantasy genre they've encountered in D&D, which is fine. Heroic fantasy can be a lot of fun, but it can also get a little repetitive, especially if player characters aren't proactive. Without clear goals, it can start to feel kind of like fantasy whack-a-mole, just killing whatever the DM drops into the room next, which also puts a lot of pressure on the game master to keep things interesting. One way to spice up a heroic fantasy game is to mash it up with another genre from this list, like mystery or supernatural horror. But it's worth noting that heroic fantasy doesn't mesh that well with Intrigue. These games are action-forward, while Intrigue is all about politics and social maneuvering. If your campaign includes at least 3 nobles, some blackmail, and a fake engagement, congratulations, you have officially left the realm of heroic fantasy. Player types who thrive in this genre.
Okay, so she's wrong there. She's definitely wrong there. Intrigue can work in heroic fantasy very well. It's just like anything else. I was going to say, aside from genre mashup, one of the big things you can do with heroic fantasy is counter the heroism. Make it more difficult for them. Nothing is quite as vexing or as entertaining as when you have a superpowered character who gets a superpowered problem that they struggle through. That, challenging somebody who's not used to being challenged is definitely something that is fantastic. And you can also do this from a superhero perspective. I always go back to Lex Luthor and Superman. Lex Luthor is a perfect foil for Superman because he constantly puts Superman in positions where he cannot use his overwhelming power. You can do the exact same thing in your heroic fantasy game, which is also why intrigue plots can work very well. Because if you have those Lex Luthor type characters and stuff who keep them from being able to use their heroic powers and use all their stuff, when the time comes, just like when Superman gets to that point where Lex Luthor screws up, steps over the line, and now Superman can go use his smash in your face powers, just like that, when you can suddenly pull out the +4 Warple sword and cast the fireball because things got out of line, it's deeply satisfying when you've been restricted from it, maybe because of an intrigue plot.
Include fighters, explorers, instigators, and optimizers. Storytellers probably aren't going to find what they're looking for here unless they're willing to make it themselves.
That's kind of stupid. Storytellers are absolutely going to find it there. There's entire genre fiction based on heroic fantasy. You just have to give them something equally heroic to go accomplish and do. There's no reason a storyteller, like a very heavily narrative player, would not like heroic fantasy. Unless what she means by storyteller player is person who likes to sit there and talk and not roll dice and really just wants to tell you about their backstory.
If you're a DM running this genre, focus on throwing fun, varied challenges at your players and giving them the freedom to solve those challenges however they want, even if that solution is burn it down and pretend it was like that when we got here. If possible, let your player characters' goals drive the story, rather than shaping some grand, overarching narrative. Sword and Sorcery is the grimier, pulpier cousin of heroic fantasy. The world is hard.
Okay, so what am I going to say about Sword and Sorcery? Sword and Sorcery is more individually focused. It is more low magic, but not low magic in the way you're thinking. It's more rare magic, and magic tends to be viewed more fantastically. It's not going to be as everyday in most Sword and Sorcery. And more than anything, Sword and Sorcery takes it doesn't take the heroic fantasy element out. You don't have like your underpowered characters, but like take Conan for an example here. Conan was never even remotely challenged by human foes. He was stronger, faster, sharper, more astute, more on point, and more alert. It was almost like he was a superhuman character. But Conan got challenged by otherworldly things. The big thing about Sword and Sorcery versus heroic fantasy, if you want to have a Sword and Sorcery world, you want to have it more grimy, you want to have it more grounded and realistic, you want to have it more like less developed in a way. And I think more importantly than anything else, what you want is you want your encounters to be predominantly human or character centric counters, like bandits, other, rival thieves, that sort of thing. And you want those truly magical encounters, that dragon, that purple worm or something, to be a truly epic type encounter, like something that people don't see this thing and it's like an apex.
Harsh and grim, and magic is more likely to be used by villains than player characters. Protagonists are usually morally gray loners, fighters, rogues, and other people who didn't get invited to join the Knightly Order and honestly wouldn't have said yes anyway. They're not on a noble quest. They're here to kill the wizard and make off with his treasure. Think 80s classics like Conan the Barbarian, The Beastmaster, Red Sonja, stories where the hero has more hair than armor and often the emotional depth of an angry bear.
This is just a sign that she is, as they say, a tourist. Not just in the hobby, but in this realm of fiction as a whole. What she is describing is Sword and Sorcery if the only thing you have done is watch 80s movies and not really pay attention to them. She speaks like somebody who has never once picked up a Robert Howard anthology or picked up a pulp magazine. Nobody has never looked at Conan or Call the Conqueror or Solomon Kane or any of these other pulp era Sword and Sorcery adjacent or sword and sorcery characters. They are not that shallow. They are not 1,000% action oriented. I mean, that's what Conan the comic book was. That is nothing like Conan the brilliant king who spoke multiple languages, who was incredibly intelligent but just very raw. And then let's look at Conan the Barbarian. One of the great juxtapositions that Conan the Barbarian put forth was that Conan often came across the quote-unquote civilized man and found a less desirable, more vile, more deceitful creature that was a lesser human than the savage. It was the savage is actually the more honorable and noble person because he's more pure and he's more honest. He may be violent, but he's honestly violent, as opposed to the lying, scheming, deceitful, and manipulative, quote, civilized man. And what Ginny has done here with this description is just rob all the depth out of what makes sword and sorcery worth playing and worth reading.
Genre is great if you want drama without much depth and the lurking possibility that the party might turn on each other for a better deal. It's not about moral quandaries or the epic battle between good and evil. It's about the kinds of problems that can be best solved with some kind of bladed weapon. Sword and sorcery can pair really well with supernatural horror and war. Anything gritty and dangerous where trust is optional and magic can be your villain's primary tool. It doesn't pair as well with epic fantasy, where characters tend to care about silly things like the greater good, or with intrigue or mystery, which rely on the characters having more than one collective brain cell and being willing to stop killing long enough to rub them together.
First part, totally wrong. Or first part, totally right. Second part, totally wrong. It doesn't tend to pair super well with things like epic fantasy, because the thing about sword and sorcery is a lot of times sword and sorcery, because it comes from pulp, is very immediate situation focused. It may have an epic story when you put it all together, but really the story is about Conan surviving in the Tower of the Elephant, and there may be greater things hinted at. They may be a vehicle for some exposition about some great philosophy about the alien world or whatever, like in Tower of the Elephant, or, the stuff in, Rogues in the House. But at the end of the day, it's very focused on what's happening, and the rest of the world doesn't care if Conan lives, dies, succeeds, or fails in whatever he's doing. It will continue to roll on and not care. It's not that epic in scale. Now, where she's wrong is obviously the mystery thing. Oh, where the characters have to have more than 2 brain cells to rub together. Like I said, come back to me, Ginny, when you speak as many languages as Conan did.
Types who thrive here include instigators, fighters, and optimizers. Anyone who enjoys punching first, and if all goes well with the punching, talking never. Again, storytellers are likely to have a rough time with this one. Chances are, if Critical Role makes you roll your eyes, this genre is more in line with how you see D&D. If you're a game master running sword and sorcery, don't worry about complex plot arcs or big picture themes. Focus on throwing your players into dangerous situations and letting them claw their way out by whatever means necessary. Definitely don't expect players to take the high road. This is the wrong kind of game to start punishing people for being murder hobos. Keep the stakes personal, the rewards shiny, and the body count nice and high. Epic fantasy is what heroic fantasy sounds like it describes.
She's actually kind of right there. It is kind of what it sounds like it describes. Epic fantasy is about the scale of the adventure. It can be the everyman heroes. Lord of the Rings is the classic example of epic fantasy. The thing about epic fantasy is the scale of the adventure. You're not going to sandbox an epic fantasy style. You will not get the epic fantasy feel from a sandbox game. And you might maybe from a sandbox game, but you're not going to hex crawl an epic fantasy. It's just not going to happen. Epic fantasy has a big, epic, overreaching and overarching theme to it. And it has to have that in order to get that scale and feel. The quest for the ring, whether you know about it or not, the quest for the ring is the linchpin of the entirety of existence. It is the definition of incredibly epic. And it can be heroic, it can be non-heroic, it can be sword and sorcery, it can be anything, as long as it's tied to that large overarching epic story. If it mixes poorly with anything, it really is Sword and Sorcery, because like I said, the feel and the grit of Sword and Sorcery is to be very personal focused. But that doesn't mean, Conan, once again, going back to the classic example that's easiest to figure out, really could be an epic fantasy, because in the end, if you put all of his stuff together, it comes to this grand epic tale of him growing into being King Conan from being the mercenary traveling from the wastes of Samaria. But even then, it kind of falls flat, because epic fantasy is about the scale of the adventure, the scale of what the characters are doing overall, and its impact on the world or the world beyond.
A sweeping tale of noble heroes out to save the world. These stories are about the grand struggle of good versus evil, and players are firmly in the good camp. They're here to save the world, fulfill their destiny, or die trying, but not until they've delivered an impassioned speech about honor or justice or the power of friendship. Think Lord of the Rings, The Wheel of Time, or the Stormlight Archive. The stakes are high, the villains are irredeemable, and the names probably have apostrophes in them. If you love slow burn plots with lots of lore, noble causes, and a dramatic reveal where someone turns out to be the long-lost heir to something, epic fantasy is your genre. It's ideal for players who want to feel important, players who want that big D. Destiny, I mean.
Drink. Really?
What did you think I meant? Epic fantasy pairs especially well with mythic fantasy and war, anything with a grand scale and the potential for a 6-book series. It doesn't mix very well with sword and sorcery, as we just discussed, and it's not a great fit for supernatural horror either. Epic fantasy players tend to want to feel powerful, and horror is all about making the player feel vulnerable. Player types who often...
You see, this is another place where she's right, but she's wrong. No, supernatural horror really doesn't mesh super well with epic fantasy, because one of the hallmarks of like a supernatural horror is that you can't overcome it. Great Cthulhu was, and always will be. You can never really defeat him, just kind of push him off. And while it's truly epic, there's no real victory to be had there. That existential dread is an essential part of the story. But then she turns around and she gets it all wrong, because epic fantasy is not necessarily about them feeling powerful and feeling strong. Some of the best epic fantasy you're ever going to have is going to be when the characters feel small and feel overwhelmed. The Lord of the Rings, the most powerful moments come from the fact that the hobbits have to step up and do things. They're not just, they're physically small. They're the definition of in every way, and is on the nose as you can be. The hobbits are not supposed to be there. They're not made. They say it outright. We're not made for great stories and big deeds, but that's where they come from. And that's where you get the epic feeling. So yes, you absolutely want that feeling of being small and powerless and overcoming. The difference with supernatural horror, and where she's right, is that in supernatural horror, you want that feeling of small and powerless, but there is no overcoming.
Love epic fantasy includes storytellers, actors, and explorers. Anyone who wants to be part of a rich, interconnected world with emotional payoff and dramatic plot twists. Instigators may struggle here, and socializers will probably feel pretty awkward when somebody starts crying at the table in session 30. If you're a DM running epic fantasy, you have gotta commit. You need a world with history, with kingdoms, with gods or dragons or ancient evils. DMs who are passionate about world building thrive in the epic fantasy genre. This is also the kind of game that benefits from tying player character backstories into the larger arc. They should feel like they're part of the story, not incidental to it. Let them become heroes, earn noble titles, fall in love, and yes, kill things, but only once they're certain it's the right thing to do. Only then can we face the greatest challenge of all, a 60-second ad break. Mythic fantasy draws from the themes of ancient myth, folklore, and legend.
Yep. That's what mythic fantasy is. Mythic fantasy doesn't necessarily draw from those things. It just has that feeling. The idea of mythic fantasy is it should feel, well, mythical. It needs to involve powers of the greater world, be it gods, fates, whatever, interfering with your characters. That's kind of the general rule of thumb there, is that if you're doing Mythic Fantasy as a big, your players should be almost everymen. They can be more powerful. Obviously, you can be like Hercules, who's half god and everything, but they should be definitively less powerful than whatever's screwing around with them.
This is the realm of gods, omens, and dark prophecies. This is the kind of game that almost certainly has gods involved, and not just as distant observers. Someone's gonna get cursed, someone's probably the chosen one, and if we're lucky, someone's hubris will get them turned into a bird or something. In Mythic Fantasy, the player characters are not just regular Joes who decided to start adventuring. They're the ones legends will be written about. Maybe they were chosen by a god. Maybe they swore vengeance against one. Or maybe their great-great-grandmother had a fling with somebody who, in hindsight, maybe glowed a little more than your average mortal. Examples of Mythic Fantasy include Princess Mononoke, Moana, The Northmen, which starts with a prophecy and ends with a sword fight in a volcano, because subtlety is for other genres. It's pretty easy to pair Mythic Fantasy with other genres because a fair amount of the flavor is in the theme. You could make a mythic mystery or a mythic supernatural horror. Epic fantasy and war are probably the most.
She's very much right there. Mythic Fantasy does really fit well with just about everything. And the main reason for that is because your Mythic Fantasy is way more about the instigation for the event. It's way more about what causes things to happen and the drivers of the narrative than it is necessarily about the characters themselves or the plot lines. I mean, let's face it, there's literally, quite literally, a Mythic Fantasy story. There is a myth about a guy shoveling horse crap.
Natural fits to combine with this style. Player types who tend to love Mythic Fantasy include storytellers, actors, and explorers. Be careful when including optimizers in these games because they're the most likely to be unhappy if you start playing fast and loose with the rules. You can give that player a bag that contains the north, south, and east winds, and they'll probably be thinking, well, it's no +1 great axe. If you're a DM running Mythic Fantasy, think of ways to incorporate symbolism and intention into your choices. The gods or other powerful divine forces should be present and active in your game, and your world building and encounter building should reflect that. I mean, Scylla wasn't born a man-eating sea monster. She just picked the wrong time to look hot and take a bath. And really, that's on her. Don't be afraid to get a little weird. This is the...
Okay, I'm going to call that a drink, but GinnyDi just essentially made she was asking for it because she went out dressed that way point. I mean, did she lose some feminism points for that?
Kind of story where everybody's a shapeshifter, where quests are seemingly impossible tasks like weaving cloth from moonlight or rescuing a live baby from the stomach of a monster. When the rules and the vibes butt heads, the vibes should always win. There are people...
Okay, supernatural horror. This one is, I mean, it's horror, obviously, and it's supernatural. Basically, this should come from an existential dread of the unknown, of something so, alien and so much greater than the characters that it's a very on the nose kind of horror, in the fact that even though the real tension comes from, like I said, the unknown and the dread, the driving force is going to be something that is beyond their ken and beyond their recognition. Now, in a lot of ways, Dungeons and Dragons is very, very bad at supernatural horror because the system is designed around a lot of the supernatural being something that's already integrated. I mean, yeah, the Great Demon King is a great, powerful entity that's that can't be understood and, existed for eons and all this stuff. But, the wizard at a certain level can summon him. So it becomes, it kind of pars it down in that way. But there's ways to do it, and especially ways to do it at low level.
People who say D&D isn't a good system for horror, and Curse of Strahd looks at those people with a judgmentally quirked eyebrow.
And she once again shows how shallow her understanding of things is. Curse of Strahd is a horror-themed setting. It's not horror. All right, it isn't. It's a D&D adventure. It's a fantasy adventure with a horror paint job on it. Even Ravenloft kind of struggles a bit with it. And Ravenloft, if you look at the elements that really make it stand out as a horror genre module, it's not, oh my God, Ravenloft so awesome with the great horror stuff that's in it. It's, oh my God, look, Ravenloft uses things like the cards and the fate game and all that other stuff to make it to where we can't predict what's happening, even if we've played this before. And it was the first D&D adventure where the bad guy actually moved around and didn't sit in the same place. Strahd could show up anywhere. And that's now commonplace in tabletop role-playing games. So it loses that element. Curse of Strahd does not sit there and laugh at this. Horror is about having power taken away. It's about being restricted. It's about the unknown. It's about that sense of uncomfortable transgression that's coming forward. It's not simply a pastiche or a palette swap to put on your game, as she's implying here with the very shallow definition.
14 Dungeon Master's Guide calls this genre dark fantasy, but both books are talking about the same thing. D&D as a haunted house. Ghosts and demons, vampires and necromancers, descriptions that make you kinda wish you didn't have to drive home from D&D alone in the dark. Of course, any genre can have undead monsters or spooky settings, but the key to supernatural horror is the overall feeling of unease. In a heroic fantasy game, the characters might make jokes about the zombies or call the undead big bad Lich McConnell, and we'd all have a good laugh. But in order for the whole game to have a proper horror vibe, there needs to be a certain amount of player buy-in.
She's right, and she's going to be wrong. There definitely needs to be a lot of player buy-in, but it's not predicated on player buy-in. If you're doing it right, even if they make the jokes and stuff, it's not going to disrupt the horror. All right. And she tipped her hat again earlier when she said D&D is a haunted house. No, D&D is a haunted house is heroic fantasy with a horror paint job. That's not actual supernatural horror.
They're opting in for a scary genre, so they need to do their part to not undermine that tone. Examples of supernatural horror include Pan's Labyrinth, Castlevania, and The Witch. Yes, the one where Anya Taylor-Joy must have sold her soul to become the reigning queen of vaguely witchy film, which sounds like a fair trade to me, honestly. This genre plays very well with mystery, and even sword and sorcery, as long as the tone is right. It's generally a little too dark to combine neatly with epic fantasy or with swashbuckling. Lots of player types can enjoy supernatural horror. The divide
Where she's correct is that it definitely doesn't fit well with epic fantasy. And it doesn't fit with epic fantasy because of what I said before. Simple fact of the matter is that epic fantasy is about overcoming those odds. Supernatural horror is about them not being something you can overcome.
line is less about what kind of gameplay people like and more about whether or not they like horror. Some people just aren't into it, and while I pity those who will never get to see The Exorcist, or Midsummer, or Carrie, or It Follows, The Shining, Get Out, The Wicker Man, The Descent, The Thing, The Fly. Sorry, I got carried away. Like a woman possessed. Anyway, the point is, I get it. Not everyone enjoys the feeling of fear. But as long as everyone's into it, these kinds of games can be a lot of fun. DMs running supernatural horror will want to focus on creating atmosphere and building anticipation. Make sure players dread what's coming long before it actually arrives. But above all,
she just showed a link for her 3 horror tips video. I actually did a reaction to it earlier, and I'll plug it here. She is... Unless she has changed everything about how she runs games in the meantime, she is the last person in the universe you should be going to learn how to run these games. Most of her tips are completely undermined by a lot of her other philosophy, and I pretty much rip it apart in that reaction.
Make sure your players still have agency. It's fun for the characters to feel powerless sometimes, but your players should always feel like they still get to make their own choices. You're going for tension, not a hostage situation. Welcome to Intrigue, the genre where...
One last little piece on the supernatural horror, that last part she said is, once again, completely wrong. Sometimes you should take away their choices. That's part of what makes it a horror setting, is that their choices were taken away. Intrigue, this is all about politicking. It's all about the movement of pieces on the game board. It's not necessarily like Intrigue is the type of game where you need to set up situations, especially early on, so they can see it when it doesn't have the higher stakes. This is the kind of situation where the players can overcome or quote unquote win an encounter, and then it be a loss on the big scale. This is where your Pyrrhic victories come in. Intrigue is about who is the king, who is the player, and who is the chess piece, and who is the pawn.
Nobody says what they mean, everyone has a knife hidden somewhere, and there is a non-zero chance that you'll find out after a year of sessions that one of the player characters was a double agent the whole time. Intrigue is all about schemes, secrets, and politics. It's less roll initiative and more roll insight. Sure, combat still happens.
Point of order here, it should never be about roll insight. Yes, you should have that in there, but one of the key things about running an intrigue plot is breaking down, and this is true for any kind of social gaming, is breaking down simple things that you would say should be one roll into several rolls. So you shouldn't be able to get by with insight. It should be insight allows you to roll for some kind of gathering information, and how you gather that information should also involve other things. Like, I'll give you an example. Normally, if your player says something along the lines of, I'm going to run down to the docks and I am going to ask the fishermen to see if I can figure out if there's anything odd about the guard captain, you would just say roll gather information. In an intrigue style game, this should be more like, all right, how are you going to go about this? Well, I'm going to dress up. I'm going to go ahead and change my clothes to be more like a regular fisherman. I'm going to go hang out, and I'm going to kind of work my way in. And if anybody asks, I'll say stuff like, I've come from a different boat and I'm just coming over to help out because of the need for extra hands or whatever. And I'm going to try and talk to them and kind of goad them into everybody making jokes about stuff to see what I can find out. And it's like, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. You're going to roll disguise. You're going to roll bluff. You're going to have to roll some, deception checks. You're going to have to roll some diplomacy checks, maybe even a perform check when you're trying to kind of get people going and making jokes back and forth. And then you're going to roll your gather information check as well. And I'm going to take all of those, and you're going to get different kinds of different pieces of information from each one. And it's going to be the collective that ends up resulting in your overall success.
But it's usually a sign that someone made a terrible mistake. The real battles in an intrigue game are fought in whispers and blackmail and back alley deals, and that means players absolutely have to know what they're signing up for. If someone shows up with a full barbarian build, they're going to feel pretty sheepish when they realize they brought a great axe to a battle of wits.
That's not true. And this just once again goes back to the lack of depth of experience here. Just because your character is a combat type does not mean they don't have a role in that kind of intrigue plot. They become just another piece on the board that moves in a different way. Knights, pawns, rooks, bishops, queens, they all have different jobs on the chessboard, and they all have value. Even the axe-swinging, door-kicking barbarian has his own value in those intrigue games. Don't take that away from them just because you can't see it as anything other than roll mental ability checks.
Think Dune or early seasons of Game of Thrones before people started solving political problems with Dragonfire, not naming any names. Intrigue is one of the most distinct genres on this list. While you can incorporate some intrigue into nearly any type of campaign, it's very easy for this genre to leave martial characters on the sidelines. I think it does pretty well when meshed with mystery or war campaigns, but it can easily clash with more straightforward genres like swashbuckling, swords and sorcery, or heroic fantasy if it's given too much weight. Player types who tend to enjoy intrigue include problem solvers, storytellers, actors, and optimizers, as long as those optimizers are optimizing for non-combat skills. DMs running intrigue should focus on building a world full of secrets, factions, and more messy interpersonal drama than a CW show.
That's not at all necessary. Intrigue can be very, very simple. The players will make it plenty complicated on their own. When you start trying to make it more complicated, you're just going to make a hodgepodge mess that nobody understands. And you're eventually going to have frustrated players who just say, DM, can I roll something?
Every major NPC needs a goal that drives their choices, even if the players never uncover it. Or better yet, uncover it, misunderstand it completely, and make everything worse. So
that part is absolutely true. That's a piece of good advice. You should never have meaningless NPCs in an Intrigue game.
social encounters should hit as hard as combat and deserve just as much prep. Ask yourself, what does this NPC want? What would make them talk? And what useful secret will the party uncover if they succeed? Remember, in an Intrigue campaign, information is loot. The players slayed the Duke not with their weapons, but with clever words, and now they can rifle through his metaphorical pockets and pull out the fact that his son and only heir has been banned from 3 dungeons for asking the gelatinous cube to engulf him slower. And
Drink.
yes, this is going to be a roleplay heavy game. If your dream session involves dramatic betrayal, a 3-hour NPC interrogation, and a bulletin board covered in red yarn, then congrats, you're in the right place. Just be warned, maybe the real villain was the friends you made along the way.
Okay, mystery. Mystery, you just have to do things the right way. One thing that's very important about mystery games, just so we're clear on this, is you better understand how all your abilities work in a D&D game, because not understanding how things like scrying work can screw up a mystery. But really, mystery, this is where your players are dumber than you think really comes into play, because it's all about positing a question. And you have to make it to where simply catching the bad guy is not good enough. There has to be understanding their motivations, figuring out why all has to be part of it too. But really, at the end of the day, mystery is exactly what it sounds like. Your players are presented with a conundrum and they need to figure it out. They need to connect the dots. And that's the important part, is they need to connect the dots. Simply finding the dot that's at the end and resolving it is not enough.
Campaigns are about saving the world. Some are about slaying the dragon, and some are about figuring out why a guy wearing 2 left boots left footprints in the bakery the night the mayor vanished. Mystery games are all about solving crimes, deciphering riddles, and pulling every thread until something unravels and the truth finally comes out. If you want to play in the world of Sleepy Hollow or Carnival Row, this is the genre for you. Plus, mystery is a good complement to almost any other genre. All kinds of stories can include a mystery as part of their plot without becoming a full-on Agatha Christie novel. In fact, I'd be surprised if anyone had played a D&D game that didn't include at least one mystery. Player types who thrive here include problem solvers and explorers. Basically, anyone who jumps out of their chair the minute an NPC takes just a second too long to answer a question about where they were last night. DMs running a mystery game should know one thing up front: your players will miss your clues. Almost all of them.
That is the best piece of advice that she has given this entire video. Your players are stupid. That doesn't mean they're actually idiotic individuals. It means that when you put this stuff together, you're dealing with perfect information. You know the beginning, you know the end, you're creating the middle, you're putting out the clues. You know how everything works, so the logic is already clicking in your head, and it's very difficult to divorce yourself of that. Anything, if you have ABC, your players will make it A.5, 2, 3, B, X, C, all on their own. If you say, hey, I got to figure this out, I need to make it A, B, C, D, E, you're going to end up with players who can't figure out anything, because they're going to add steps in between with their imperfect information. And even if you give them a simple 3-part solution, if they botch the middle part, they're going to come to a completely different place and have to back up, and you're going to get plenty of ground out of that. Your players are not dealing with perfect information, so they are far, far less intelligent in that regard than you think.
Just assume that what seems painfully obvious to you will most likely be completely invisible to them. You'll need to scatter plenty of breadcrumbs and be ready to give them a nudge when they get stuck arguing over whether or not the goat should be a suspect. To maintain a sense of urgency, you'll want to make sure the situation constantly escalates. If they're hunting a killer, more people should die. If they're tracking a thief, more stuff should go missing. If they're looking for a shapeshifter, I would be disappointed if they weren't rolling insight checks against each other within the week. Pacing mysteries in D&D can be tricky.
That's not entirely true. It's not bad. That's very rudimentary. It doesn't need to escalate. There just needs to be some sort of motivating factor behind it. For instance, it can just not matter after a certain while, or the trail can go cold and the ability to solve it can start to disappear after a while, or there can be other things that drive you to have to figure it out more quickly, such as you only have so many days to get there. You have to be in another town after a certain amount of time. Whatever the case may be, there just needs to be a pressure to keep moving forward and to keep doing things. Because the number one thing that's going to screw up your mysteries for players is analysis paralysis. What they're going to do is they're going to get so stuck trying to figure stuff out, they're going to sit there and not do anything. You have to have an impetus to make them keep acting. Because when players act, like even if they're off course, when players take action, that gives you the opportunity to have responses to those actions that get them back on track. You can't do anything when all they do is sit there and talk out of character.
You can't always control when the players solve something, so build in some structure that prevents them from spontaneously guessing the whole thing in session 2. Maybe they need all 3 keys to open the vault. Maybe the ritual can't be interrupted until the blood moon. Maybe the villain's lair can only be opened on leap days. That'll give you a few years to stall.
I disagree with that. That gets into the territory of railroading, when you're essentially denying them the ability to progress naturally. Now, you can have things like that maybe change different aspects of the adventure, but you shouldn't penalize them for figuring it out quickly.
Oh, and don't forget the wild card, magic. There are plenty of D&D spells that can ruin your mystery if you don't think about them in advance. Speak with Dead, Zone of Truth, Detect Thoughts, Scrying. Any one of these could solve most traditional mysteries in a matter of minutes. But with a little forethought, you can make sure none of your dead bodies still have heads. Ooh, what a clip that'll be out of context.
All right, swashbuckling is not so much a genre as it is a style. It's really just the high octane, high adventure kind of whimsical adventuring. When I think swashbuckling, I think exaggerated. I think rule of cool actually matters in this type of game. I think allowing, we'll say, cosmetic stuff that probably shouldn't be allowed to happen. And when I say cosmetic stuff, I don't mean like the actual physical aspects of the character or something. I'm talking about like boats that shouldn't exist because they don't actually function, swords that are of ridiculous size and proportions, maneuvers that in no way would ever work because physics. Basically, swashbuckling is a style of where everything is supposed to be energy, intensity, and excitement cranked up.
Buckling is all about dashing heroes, witty banter, and dramatic flair. It's a genre where style matters just as much as substance, possibly more. If there was ever a time to bust out the cloak of billowing, it's in a swashbuckling campaign. Expect daring escapes, chase scenes, and at least one formal duel after a character causes offense at a fancy shindig. At least one character could be accurately played by Antonio Banderas. Sorry, did that age me? Pedro Pascal, then. If Epic Fantasy...
You cannot compare Pedro Pascal and Antonio Banderas. They're not anywhere close to the same. Antonio Banderas definitely fits swashbuckling. He was Zorro, for Christ's sake. He was in Desperado. I mean, lots of awesome stuff going on there. Pedro Pascal is just a whiny, Hollyweird douche.
Fantasy is the noble heart of the genre list. Swashbuckling is the flirty wink from across the tavern. Picture Pirates of the Caribbean, The Princess Bride, The Mask of Zorro. If anybody interacts with a chandelier in any way during a fight scene, you're golden. This genre plays well with any other genre that's allowed to be overdramatic and fun. Heroic fantasy, and even crossing the streams. I know, we've barely mentioned that one. It doesn't mix as well with supernatural horror or intrigue. Swashbuckling players are too busy leaping from windows onto horseback and kissing dangerous people to practice anything like restraint. Actors and instigators tend to have a lot of fun with swashbuckling. DMs running these games should focus on bold action and cinematic set pieces, like rooftop chases and dastardly plots that must be foiled. Social challenges and combat should take up roughly equivalent space, including the occasional romantic subplot if your table's up for that. And speaking of romance, don't underestimate the power of a ship. No, literally, give them a boat. Not only is piracy a staple of the swashbuckling genre, but a ship lets players bounce between exotic locations so they can cause trouble and then narrowly escape the consequences.
Swashbuckling does work very well when it's episodic, and she is kind of correct here with what it doesn't work well with. Swashbuckling can't be slow. It just can't. If you want to have that type of campaign, any kind of mystery or intrigue plot, I mean, intrigue actually can work well as long as it's exaggerated enough. But like if you want to do like a supernatural horror or mystery type thing, it kind of needs to be a situation where it's like a palate cleanser or like a cool off before the next goofy thing. But the reason a ship, like a boat, works really well for swashbuckling style adventures is because it needs to be kind of episodic. The impact is very tied up. It's very over the top. And at the end of a particular exchange or adventure or whatever you want to call it, there shouldn't be any reason for them to stick around in that town. And there should probably be several reasons for them to leave.
Important not to police player characters too much in this kind of game. Being bold and daring should be rewarded in this genre, not punished. Oh, one last thing. Everybody should get to play a charming character if they want to, regardless of whether or not they personally know how to flirt or lie or deliver witty repartee. It's the DM's job to treat high charisma characters as high charisma, even if the player has no riz. And yes, I hate that I just said the word riz as much as you do. In a war campaign, the party's actions shape the direction of a larger...
Okay, so war campaign can be taken in two different directions. It can be taken in the almost war gaming direction, where it's just about commanding large scale and moving in big units and that sort of thing and actual tactics. But generally, when you talk war in a tabletop role-playing game, and honestly, the real reason that D&D was originally invented was to drag down the overarching bird's eye view of a war game into the personal level of a single soldier. War is... it should be, in a lot of ways, about how the war affects the characters. And it should really be about the war is the front and center driving force of everything. And a lot of times it's going to be about how the characters interact with and around the war. The big problem is to get this urge to make the characters super important in the war for no reason.
Conflict. Maybe they're hunting down enemy scouts. Maybe they're brokering a fragile alliance. Maybe they're smuggling supplies across the front lines. The point is, they're part of something big. Their missions might be small in scope compared to the war at large, but they're never low stakes.
That is completely untrue. They should be low stakes sometimes, depending on what you're going for. Because one big theme you will find in good war stories is all the sacrifice for nothing. I went through hell. I got trapped in a bombed out building for 5 days with minimal food, eating rats and stuff, fighting the Germans or whatever in World War II because I was part of some kind of decoy mission that was totally unnecessary. Or, I fought in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 that literally occurred after the war was over and the peace treaty had already been signed. All that death, all that destruction was for nothing. That is a concept that, if you know any veterans, that's one that a lot of them struggle with is what was it all for? Why was I there? What did I change? That's something that shouldn't be devoid. That's something that shouldn't be removed. Your war campaign should not be devoid of that. It should not be taken away. You can't be super important to everything, regardless of scale. So that's a piece of advice that she put out that's not very good.
War stories can go a lot of different directions. You can lean into battlefield tactics and military maneuvers, or focus on the human cost and ethical complexity of the fight. Maybe your players are hardened warriors, or maybe they're terrified village recruits armed with a pitchfork and a dream. Either way, this genre works great for campaigns with big plots, big themes, and the occasional dramatic speech yelled from horseback. Movies like Troy and 300 are good examples of this, as is that one Game of Thrones episode about the Battle of Winterfell that took them 11 weeks of night shoots to film. I'm sure it would have been great if we could see any of it. Basically, they're stories where the characters aren't just lone wolves, they're fighting for what they believe in, alongside thousands of fellows. But they're not just foot soldiers. They have the power to really change the direction of the conflict.
Why do they have to be fighting for what they believe in? Why can't they be somebody who's there because they're a conscript? Why can't they be somebody who signed up because they wanted a steady paycheck and 3 squares a day, and this is just the shit they got to deal with to be there? Why are we taking all of the war out of war and focusing on like the Hollywood aspect of war? No, sometimes they should have no impact. Sometimes surviving should be the mission.
This genre goes well with epic fantasy and can also mix with intrigue or sword and sorcery, depending on whether you go all politics or no politics. Player types who tend to enjoy war campaigns include fighters, optimizers, and problem solvers. These games reward strategic thinking, but also have a pretty healthy dose of combat. DMs running a war campaign need to be thinking on 2 levels: the big picture and the boots on the ground. What's happening in the wider conflict? Who's gaining ground? Who's losing resources? And what's the status of key locations? The players don't need to know all of this, but you do, because their actions need to ripple out and change things.
It's another great piece of advice from good old generic Jenny there. That is like I said, it's pretty surface level. That's why we call her what we call her. But that's a very key and very important piece of information. You, as the GM, need to know what's happening. Unless you are running a faction-based game where the players are actively controlling the armies on the large scale, you better know what's going on, because the ebb and flow of the war is very important to the personal aspect of the character.
If they assassinate an enemy general, their side should gain an advantage. If they sabotage a supply line, their allies should be better equipped.
Not necessarily. Once again, maybe they sabotage. Now, if they kill a general, yeah, it should probably matter. But they sabotage a supply line, or they raid a supply line. Who's to say that those supplies are too little too late? Why are they not too little too late? Come on. Sometimes you sacrifice everything to gain nothing.
And if they fail to stop the enemy ritual to raise a bunch of undead reinforcements, well, guess who's on skeleton cleanup duty? One of the strengths of this genre is the chance to explore both large-scale strategy and intimate human experiences. You're not just telling a story about armies, you're also telling a story about soldiers. Ideally the kind who enter the combat covered in mud, badly wounded, and cradling a dying NPC that they only met 3 sessions ago. Sleep, Frank. You'll see the ocean again.
Why are they not cradling a dying PC? Oh, because you're not killing your characters. It's probably better if they have their own person die. Why not? And why aren't they dying themselves? It's very, very much the surface level, happy-go-lucky safety tool versions of war.
Crossing the streams is what happens when fantasy gets bored and decides to invite sci-fi, time travel, and urban fantasy to come by for a sleepover. Portals, parallel dimensions, spaceships. If you've ever wanted to fend off laser fire with a longsword, this is your genre. Maybe you fall through a portal and find yourself in the world of one of your favorite movies or books. Maybe the party finds an abandoned research facility buried under a mountain and accidentally reactivates the cryo chamber marked "Do not, under any circumstances, unfreeze."
So, Expedition to the Barrier Peaks. Anything from Dragon Riders of Pern. Yeah, there's people who hate it. There's people who love it. To me, this is not so much a genre or a type of game. It's just, I mean, it can be kind of a nifty thing. One of the fun things to do is to put stuff that the players will know about that the characters don't. Even better if the players miss it. Like when you hand them a modern microscope and they spend forever trying to figure out what the hell it is, and they never really just pay attention to the description and figure out what it is.
Your campaign starts out in a fantasy kingdom, but then a mysterious rift opens to your living room and your characters come hang out with you. If that sounds like an embarrassing level of self-insert to you, it's important that you know that Elminster, one of the most powerful wizards in Faerun, canonically traveled to modern-day Earth to hang out with Ed Greenwood. Seriously, you can do whatever you want. Stories like Outlander.
That's because Elminster eventually became self-referential and was essentially, he basically developed into a satire.
Alice in Wonderland and the Howl's Moving Castle book, but not the movie, weirdly, are great examples of what happens when a story just up and changes its genre. I wouldn't say that it works especially well or especially poorly with many genres in particular, but I do think it takes a very specific sort of group to enjoy this kind of thing. I would not recommend springing it on unsuspecting players. If Greg showed up all pumped to do solemn dwarven cleric things and then suddenly finds himself in a Dunkin' Donuts parking lot in 1980s Chicago, he may be less than thrilled. This genre is most likely to be fun for instigators and honestly socializers, the people who tend to be the least devoted to the verisimilitude of the story. For people who get bored with pursuing the same
Did not have GinnyDi using the word verisimilitude on my bingo card.
plotline in the same setting for too long, concepts like these can keep things interesting by allowing you to basically change the whole game while keeping your characters. DMs running these games should embrace the weird. Let players bring their spoils back from other worlds, even if they're totally out of place. Frankly, that's kind of the point. Who doesn't want to be Bruce Campbell swinging around a chainsaw in the Middle Ages? Crossing the Streams doesn't have to be played for comedy, but you should definitely be open to chaos. If they find a phaser in a spaceship and then bring it back home to shoot goblins with, you have no one to blame but yourself. In case it wasn't clear by me talking about mixing genres the whole time, none of these are all or nothing. And I'm sure there will be people who think that I miscategorized some of my examples.
You deliberately, or not deliberately, but you explicitly miscategorized a lot of them. But right back to what I was saying, a lot of that's because good old GinnyDi is, in a lot of ways, the definition of a tourist. If she's not a tourist herself anymore, just because of what she is like the representative of tourism. She very strongly strikes me as the kind of person who never picked up a fantasy novel until she realized that cosplaying D&D was a way to make money.
That's because genre isn't really a quantifiable division. Most games will have little pieces of
genre is explicitly a quantifiable division. That's what it is. It is a division between different kinds of things. Just because there is some flavor from other things in it does not mean that things don't fit within a genre. I can turn to my bookshelf right now, and 90% of what's on it is definitively fantasy, regardless of whether or not it has some historical aspect or some sci-fi aspect or whatnot to it. It's still fantasy. It is a quantifiable division because that's literally what genres are. It's like saying that the Dewey Decimal System is not quantifiable divisions of where books are in a library.
Almost all these genres at some point. Think of them less like a box that you have to close yourself into and more as a set of tools that you can use to communicate about games. So those are the 10 genres that work in D&D. But real quick, let's talk about 2 that don't. I get questions sometimes about how to make the system work for both of these concepts. And
just a point here. I can't remember for the life of me what 2 she goes into, but I've always been a big proponent of this, and this is something to think about. If you really want to run a game, in particular if you want to run a full-on campaign of a particular genre, you should probably look for a system that's designed for it. Just because D&D or Call of Cthulhu or Interlock or 2D20 or whatever can work for something does not mean that there are not games that are specifically designed for it that work better. And honestly, I think that's part of the enduring power and the enduring lifespan of D&D is that, in particular, the Die 20 system that was made after Wizards of the Coast took over, starting with 3rd edition, D20 system D&D is as generic as GinnyDi's advice. She's generic GinnyDi, it's generic role-playing game. Die 20 is about the most versatile out there, except for maybe Call of Cthulhu's Die 100 system.
And while D&D is weirdly adaptable, there are moments, even for a D&D lover like me, where I have to gently say, maybe try another system.
D&D is not weirdly adaptable. The Die 20 system was designed that way. That is probably the most brilliant thing that Wizards of the Coast did. They super simplified the D20 system that was already designed with D&D, and they made sure that it was you could be easily manipulated to fit whatever you wanted to play, which means that it gets a broad appeal, because while there may be a better game for your table than D&D, D&D fits for almost every table.
First, low magic. I recently had someone ask me how to run a D&D game with no magic, and the short version of my answer was don't. Magic is a fundamental part of D&D as a system.
All right, so she just did a slip there. Low magic and no magic are not the same thing. I am the king of low magic D&D campaigns. They work just fine, especially in a 3rd edition, but really 5th edition works just fine for low magic. You just make a low magic game and you focus on enemies that are more human focused, and you adjust your encounter levels and you adjust things to fit what those characters have. Now, I will say it's a little harder with 5th edition, mainly because 5th edition once again beefed up spellcasters, making cantrips that you can use to infinity, minimizing restrictions. But you want to do low magic, you better get real strict about them spell components and that sort of thing. And it's definitely doable. I've done it for years.
Getting rid of it would not only mean cutting most of the classes, but it would also put a ton of monsters off limits too. Not to mention that the game is balanced around the existence of magic, not just for dealing damage, but also as the only significant source of healing. Aside from a good night's sleep, of course. Nature's healing potion.
Which is awful, and one of the worst things that 5th edition ever did. The video game click rest, get all hit points back nonsense.
Looking for a low or no magic medieval RPG, there are games that are built for that. Ironsworn, which is described as a dark fantasy RPG, but allows customization of the setting to accommodate whatever kinds of themes you do and don't want to include. It's described as flexible enough to accommodate both fantasy and historical fiction, which obviously is pretty low magic. Best of all, it's free, so if it turns out that you actually do want magic, you can just quietly delete the PDF and nobody has to know. The other theme I don't think D&D is good for is non-violence. If you're looking for a low or no combat game, you technically can pull it off in D&D, but you're going to be ignoring a pretty significant chunk of the mechanics. Again, there are games that are built specifically to be non-violent.
Here's the thing. While yes, like a game like Call of Cthulhu is infinitely superior, and Gumshoe, any kind of investigative game is going to have more nuance to arbitrating social encounters. I already explained how you do that when we were talking about Intrigue. All you do is you break your social encounters down into their components where you have more opposed roles. Instead of just roll and gather information, you have bluff and disguise versus perception or spot or whatever the case may be. You have diplomacy checks. You have perform checks. You have all of intimidate checks. You have all of these things that get broken down into opposed roles between the NPCs and the players, or the players and other characters, or whatever the case may be. And that's all you got to do. Now, where I would say that not necessarily non-violence, but low violence D&D campaigns come into kind of an issue is to keep with the theme and to keep with the feel of the game. You may want to scale back the combat rolls, because you don't want your game dominated by 5,000 hit point slog where we spend 4 hours beating each other with swords. You've got to reduce those combat. You got to simplify combat a little bit to make it truly function. But really, you can accomplish that by just playing really, really low level. And like I said, expanding the use of skills in non-combat situations.
Example, Wanderhome, which is like Redwall if the mice could just hang out in their little mouse kingdom without having to fight little mouse battles. Even the mice can't escape the horrors of war. In Wanderhome, you play little animal folk traveling through a mystical pastoral world. It's not just combat-free, it is explicitly anti-violent. The world has already been through war, and now, as the game says, there is no violence here anymore. There's even a playbook called the Veteran, who carries a sword that they're never meant to draw again. Technically, they can unsheath it and kill someone, but if they do, the character is immediately removed from the game. Or if you want to fall somewhere a bit more moderate on the cute pastoral animals to brutal murder hobos spectrum of gaming, Blades in the Dark might be a good option. I know the word blades in the title makes that sound unlikely, but I'm living proof that you can talk a lot about swords and still be completely harmless. Characters can fight, but there are no specific rules for combat. It's handled the same way as any other action in the game.
And that doesn't really change it from being that way. It's just simplified combat. Blades in the Dark is not some social game.
Game is handled. That means if you want to...
honestly, the problem with Blades in the Dark is that it's it's one of those, I think it's Fate or Powered by the Apocalypse games that just has, is just basically an incomplete game that they give you and say, just kind of wing it for the rest of it.
Play Blades in the Dark with little or no combat, you can choose to do that. Some will argue that other genres from this list would also be better served by other games, and that's probably true. There are games built for mysteries, built for horror, built for modeling large-scale military movements, but you're also allowed to just like D&D and want to play D&D. And if you do, this genre list is a great tool to bring to the table for Session Zero. The best games happen when everyone is on the same page. Pair it with the list of player types, and you'll be way ahead of the game when it comes to understanding what kind of story your group actually wants to tell. Whether that means making a red yarn-covered conspiracy corkboard or attempting to smuggle a sci-fi phaser into a medieval feast hall. You can find my video all about player types right here.
Okay, so that's enough of GinnyDi right there. So, a lot of decent, albeit generic advice in there. A lot of missed opportunities, a lot of bad information that comes from just being super, super surface level. And at the end of the day, I would encourage you, if you want to play something, look for the games that are there. And at the very minimum, strip some of the mechanics and stuff out of those games, put them into your games to make them better. So for instance, if you want to run, mystery or some kind of intrigue game, get some Call of Cthulhu stuff out and say, how can I adapt my D&D to mimic these things? What mechanics can I rip off that can add to this experience here? But other than that, just let me know what you thought in the comment section below. Like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.